two NBA player props here on PrizePicks for Wednesday, November 1st. Before I get started, link in the description below. Hop into the premium Discord at $9.30 per month. So I post all the plays I'm making on PrizePicks. We also have other premium cappers in there as well that post all of their plays, research, and analysis. It's a super positive community overall. Everyone in there really just trying to help each other cash. I also need to mention I'm not a gambling expert, and this is not financial advice. These are simply plays I'm personally looking at making. Hopefully give you guys some insight and analysis to then make your own player prop decisions here. Again, no one's pressing submit on those parlays other than yourselves. But let's get right into it, you guys. Massive Wednesday slate here. To recap yesterday, Donovan Mitchell finished with 41.1 fantasy. He only played 29 minutes. The blowouts absolutely killed this line. It was weird. He only played he played the 9 minutes in the first quarter, and then he didn't come into 5 minutes left in the second quarter. But anyways, 29 minutes, that's not enough for Donovan. Finished with 41.1 fantasy. So, if you don't understand how blowouts work and how they impact player props, I don't know if you guys should be betting. I know I saw some comments to people talking about how Donovan Mitchell sold, but we have to move on from the blowouts. Nonetheless, let's not waste any time, you guys. Two player props that I do like. Let's go. The first one's going to be Kuzma over 35 fantasy score. I think this line a little bit too low for this game environment specifically. This game has easily the highest over-under on the slate at 238.5, and the Hawks are actually 9-point favorites in this one, which to me is a little bit weird considering the Hawks defense and the Hawks pace really matches up well with the Washington Wizards defense and the Wizards pace. So both these teams play no defense, and both these teams play at an extremely fast pace. We look at this really quickly. Game environment, Wizards play at the fastest pace in the NBA. The Hawks play at the 7th fastest pace. Defensive rating, the Wizards have the 2nd worst defensive rating, and the Atlanta Hawks have the 8th worst defensive rating. So with those two aspects combined, I think this is a great game environment, and a fantasy score line that's a little bit low for Kyle Kuzma, given how he's kind of been in blowouts this season. So we look at Kyle Kuzma in his game log this season. Let's actually look at his game log, fantasy score game log this season. And we look at these games, right? 26 minutes, 31 fantasy points. 36 minutes, 42.6 fantasy points. 25 minutes, 33.4. So he's finished with 30-plus fantasy points in all 3 games this season. And he's gone over this line once, right? But 26 minutes, he finished with 31. He plays 30 minutes. This is an easy over. 25 minutes, he finished with 33.4. He plays 30 minutes. This is an easy over. He's been in some serious blowouts, but I love the volume here for Kyle Kuzma. 15 field goal attempts in 26 minutes, 18 field goal attempts in 25 minutes, 23 field goal attempts in 36 minutes. If Kyle Kuzma gets 23 field goal attempts in a game with a 238.5 over-under, there's no question he's going to go over this line of 35. Literally, the only risk here is blowout risk. If Kyle Kuzma plays 30 minutes, this should be absolutely free here, in my opinion. So we look at top four, just even going back to last season, right? Top scoring fantasy score game log versus the Hawks last season. Look how many forwards essentially smashed this line against the Hawks. Literally so many, including Kyle Kuzma. Absolutely including Kyle Kuzma. We look at Kyle Kuzma's fantasy score game log versus Atlanta. Let's actually type this in. Versus Atlanta with Washington. He's hammered this line, I believe, a good amount of times, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 of 6 times against the Hawks. He's hit the over on this line, including last season a couple times. At Atlanta, he finished with 37.1, and then at home, he finished with 48 fantasy points against Atlanta, 25, 10, and 6, right? We look at forwards, fantasy score game log this season versus the Hawks. Giannis had 49.7, Julius Randle had 41.9. Both the kind of wing forwards for the Hornets, PJ Washington had 33, and Hayward had 30.1. Right, so they're not really able to stop. I think Jalen Johnson's going to be starting against Kyle Kuzma, and I think Kyle Kuzma can absolutely dominate him. We look at just other high usage, high volume players against the Hawks. Anthony Edwards had 45.5, Brunson 40.1, Barrett 38.6, LaMelo Ball 37.2, and Terry Rozier 36. RJ Barrett here, 26, 3, and 6 with a steal and 3 turnovers. It's a very attainable line for a player like Kyle Kuzma, who's going to see massive volume. Kyle Kuzma debatably sees more volume than any of these guys here, except for Anthony Edwards. But he's going to see a ton of volume here. I think there's just a variety of ways for Kuzma to go over this line here. He is averaging, let's see what he's averaging on the season. He's averaging 1.03 fantasy points per minute. I think, if he can play 30-plus minutes in this one, should be very close and, should be easy over. Given the game environment, we look at his odds here as well. He's currently minus 125 on BetMGM and minus 125 on Caesars to go over 30.5 PRA. So, favored to go hit at least 31 PRA for us tonight. If he can hit 31 PRA, I like his fantasy score here. Given his ability, he is I think, an underrated defensive player. for getting steals and blocks specifically. So I like Kyle Kuzma here, given the game environment. 238.5 over-under, you guys. Easily the highest over-under on the slate. I was want to target specifically this game here. Kuzma on RotoWire projected for 32+ minutes tonight. I think he could see 35 in a close game. Let me know in the comments below how you feel about this one. The second play here is going to be another fantasy score prop, and this is one I was actually waiting for to hit the board. It's going to be Sengun over 38.5. I think this is my favorite play on the board personally. Given the matchup and given the usage that Sengun is kind of seeing now with this Houston team. I think Ime Udoka, the head coach of the Rockets, knows he's the kind of their best player. He's over this line. You can see 45, and this is preseason, by the way, but during the season, 31.6, 55.3, and 35.5, right? So it's 30+ fantasy points in all 3 games this season for Sengun, right? He played 28 in a blowout against Orlando, finished with 31.6, 14, 8, and 6, no defensive stats. 55.3 against San Antonio, 25, 14, and 7, 2 steals and a block. And then 35.5 here against Golden State, which was somewhat of a blowout, 19, 5, and 7, and no defensive stats, right? But Sengun last season versus the Hornets in 2 games, 48.7 fantasy, 53.4 fantasy, absolutely dominated the Hornets last year. And that includes with Mark Williams as the starting center, who he's going up against tonight. All right, Mark Williams started in this game. He finished 12 and 13, played 26 minutes. Like Sengun last year against the Hornets, same scenario, 14, 21, 3, 2, and 1. Dominated, absolutely dominated. We look at the odds here for Sengun that obviously very, very much so correlate to his fantasy score line. -135, -148 to give us a block tonight. Current PRA, over 31.5 PRA, -148, -145. Over 21.5 PA, -145, -148. Right, odds are absolutely terrific for us. We look at the matchup here, 29th best matchup, or essentially the second best matchup for centers as far as blocks go. 3rd best matchup for PRA against centers as well. We look at centers fantasy score game log this season versus the Hornets. Duren in 35 minutes, 14, 17, 3 assists, 1 steal, 2 blocks, 42.9 fantasy. Capella, 31.6 fantasy in 29 minutes, had no assists and only 1 steal. Deron Sharp in 10 minutes, 24.1 fantasy, right? We look at forwards, similar, right? Dorian Finney-Smith, who played the center position versus the Charlotte Hornets, 36.9 fantasy, 19-7, 1-1, and 2 blocks. Sengun on the season here, you can see he's currently averaging 1.35 fantasy points per minute. Just way too low. Absolutely way too low for Sengun, who should play 30+ minutes tonight. We look at the team, the Hornets, second most points in the paint to opponents this season. Second most defensive rating as well. The Hornets just not very good. Actually, they're not bad. 11th worst defensive rating in the NBA, but they allow a ton of points in the paint. We know even dating back to last season, centers versus the Hornets is an absolute smash spot here. When the board dropped, or when I saw these matchups, I said to myself, any fantasy score line for Sengun or under 40, I'm taking it. And at 30.5, it's an absolute sweet spot here. These are the 2 plays for this YouTube video. Kuzma, 35 fantasy. Sengun, 38.5 fantasy. Both overs. Let me know in the comments below about these 2. Drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and as always, let's cash.